The last session before lunch is by Rachel Borchardt. She's an associate librarian here at AU, and she's going to be talking about resources and metrics for measuring and maximizing research impact. So I'll turn it over to you, Rachel.
Okay, thanks for having me. I will try and make this brief yet informative. We'll see how that goes. I could talk all day about metrics, so hopefully this will kind of pique your interest. And for any of you who I've seen recently, this may be identical information. Feel free to tune me out for the next 20 minutes. So starting with, come on, there we go. Why metrics? It's the primary evaluation tool that people are using to evaluate your research impact. So it's a good thing to know about sooner than later. Now is the time, which is why I'm here. But it's used in a lot of decisions, including tenure, promotion, and even grants. So we can use them to our advantage to make sure that you are being shown in your best light, essentially. It's no longer enough to just publish, but we also have to demonstrate impact, and that is true at AU, but it's also true broadly in academia these days. So we're going to talk about kind of three main stages about how you can maximize your research impact, starting with making strategic decisions when you are publishing. And apologies to those of you who are not in journal-heavy fields. Most metrics are centered around journals and journal articles, so that's mostly what I'll be talking about today. But the main takeaway today is that there is help for you in all of this. So if this doesn't apply to you, don't worry, there is still help available. Anyway, so making strategic decisions on where to publish, getting your research out there so that other scholars are reading and discovering it, and then tracking your metrics so that you can make a compelling case when it's time to go up for tenure, promotion, to apply for grants, all of those fun things. So starting with, and some quick notes. Everything that I will be talking about, all of the resources are available at tinyurl.com/AUmetrics. And I'll show this again at the end, but I will be talking about a lot of resources, so don't worry, it's all in the guide. And all of these resources are free for you, almost all of the resources, there's one exception, from on or off campus. And some other quick notes before we dive in. Hopefully everyone's written this down. What I'm saying is not necessarily concrete facts, and ultimately you're going to be guided by a lot of different guidelines, including ones written by your department, by AU, by grant guidelines, et cetera, et cetera. I'm here to give advice, but I'm definitely not an evaluator by any means. So when in doubt, ask people who are evaluating you or others who have gone through evaluation processes. And metrics is a very tricky thing that gets interpreted and understood very differently, depending on your discipline, as well it should be. So this is all fairly generic. So make sure that you are familiar with how things work in your department, because things change. All right, so strategic publication decisions, research prior to publication. This is kind of the first step in maximizing metrics. One of the main ways to do that is essentially to be looking at journals in your field and figuring out which are the ones that have the highest impact according to the metrics. There are a few major journal impact metrics. Hopefully everyone is familiar with impact factor, but I will be talking about it. And there are two others, SJR and the H5 index, and they're all designed to weight the quality of journals in disciplines. And just to note, these three metrics are very similar, but they are not directly comparable to each other. So I would not compare an impact factor versus an SJR because they all use different formulas. All right, so starting with impact factor, this is available through Journal Citation Reports. That's a database we subscribe to. It will give you both impact factor numbers and will also rank them by categories. So you can see here, if you select a category, in this case I believe it's neuroscience, so these would be the top journals ranked by impact factor for neuroscience. This is absolutely something that is used fairly heavily when evaluating you. So I highly recommend just looking at this. If you aren't already familiar, you may think you know what those top things are, but the categories are very heavily weighted towards the sciences. Once we start getting outside of the sciences, they are much broader categories that may not represent your specific discipline or subdiscipline very well. So you may think that you got it covered, you know what journals you should be aiming for, but the metrics may tell you otherwise. I know that's kind of a harsh way to say that, but just check. You'll be surprised. Or you might be, hopefully you won't be. So similarly, SJR is kind of a competing product brought to you by Scimago, which is an independent research group out of the Netherlands that create a similar ranking to impact factor. But we can also look up rankings by not only subject area, but subject category. These categories are different than the ones that Thomson Reuters and Journal Citation Reports offer. This is designed to be a little friendlier towards the social sciences. So if you're a social scientist, you may find a category that describes your discipline slightly better. For example, you can see we drill down to behavioral neuroscience, where in Web of Science we only had one broad category for all of neuroscience. So, because the name of the game is ultimately you want to find a journal where you're saying, I published in the top journal out of 60 in this category. So the better category you can find, the better you're going to look, right? So this is a freely available resource, Scimago, jr.com. And finally, Google always gets into these games. They produce their own metrics called H5. They just produce a top 20 for different categories. You can see here neurology, totally different from neuroscience. So all these categories are very different. This has the most specialization for the humanities, with a caveat that your specific discipline may still not be covered in any 3 of these, but it's a good idea to try and see which categories best represent your discipline and your research, and then look at those top journals. All right, so some other considerations. This is kind of the culture part of metrics. What do people in your department think? If you can't find a good discipline or your journals that you know are highly valued in your field don't have any of these metrics, journal acceptance rates is usually the next metric that gets used. When you're publishing, a big consideration is niche versus broad versus interdisciplinary, because usually the top journals are going to be very broad and or are review journals, as we all probably know by now. However, if you want to target your subdiscipline, you might want to be publishing in a smaller niche journal. So these are all kind of things that you want to think about and how your metrics are going to reflect in those decisions. So I'm not saying don't publish in a niche journal, but I'm saying if you do, think about what it's going to look like on paper down the road. Does that make sense, hopefully? Okay. For book metrics, there are not that many ways to rank prestige when it comes to book publications, except for this kind of vague thing of publisher prestige. Usually each department knows the good publishers, but there are very few actual lists of what publishers those should be, and they don't have any official metrics. So, and finally, this is all at the journal level, not the individual article level. So, for individual article levels, we have citation counts, and this is the primary way that we measure your specific article's impact. We have 3 different databases that all count citations. You can see along the left or the right-hand side, this is Web of Science citation counts. Those are easy to pull up. And there's usually a lot of overlap between the 3, but often they will find unique citations that the other 2 miss. Just a reminder again, tinyurl/AU metrics is how you can get access to all 3 of these resources to pull up your citation counts. And there are other metrics other than citations that are increasingly being used to measure the impact or potential impact of your articles. Usage counts is kind of the first metric that's being used more often. How often people are viewing your article, how often people are downloading your article. Web of Science even has a usage count that they're beta testing within their system. But the ability to get usage counts is very hit or miss. Some publishers offer it, some don't, some refuse to ever give you usage counts. So, yay. And then there's these emerging metrics, aka alt metrics, which are mainly indicators of attention or engagement but not necessarily impact. So if people are tweeting about your articles, if people are writing about it in Wikipedia or Facebook or blogging about it, altmetrics can capture all of that, which kind of also tells a story about the way that people are engaging with your work. Possibly scholars, possibly not scholars. So there are a number of tools that capture that sort of attention and engagement. Altmetric at altmetric.com is one of them, and there are a few others. Okay, so part 2, and hopefully I'm going fast enough, is once you've written your article, how can you make sure that people are finding it? In a few ways, creating profiles, publishing open access, creating engaging abstracts and keywords, and signing up for scholarly networks. And we'll go through each of those very quickly. If you have not created a Google Scholar profile, I highly recommend doing so. This is actually a specific recommendation that the CFA gives, that they would like to see your work when you go up for promotion or tenure in a Google Scholar profile, because you can pull together all of your articles in a way that nobody else can. And you can see metrics, including citation counts, right on that page. So sign up and you select which work should be associated with your profile. Open access is one of those fun issues on campus. My stance on it is that there are studies that correlate open access with increased citation counts. This would be one of them, because the idea is that if it's not behind a paywall, more people will actually get to the full text of your article and are therefore more likely to be using it in their research. Researchers, like anyone else, often take the easy route, so if they can find it, they'll use it. So open access does not directly affect the impact factors and the other rankings that we are talking about. Some of them are very highly ranked. Some of them don't have impact factors because they're too new. But this is often a perception issue. And there are tools to evaluate the credibility of an open access publication if you are deciding to publish there, including the Beall's list of predatory publishers, which are people that are out to make money off of you publishing open access. And the library is more than happy to help you with that if you're looking to evaluate the credibility of a journal where you want to publish. Abstract and keywords, essentially pick words that people are going to be searching for and words that make it sound like they want to read the full text of the article. So there is a primary audience of appealing to your niche discipline of scholars, but there's also a wider community that could be using your work for a variety of purposes. And the more you try and connect with them using words that they can understand and search for, the more likely they are to read and possibly use and maybe even cite your work. Okay, and finally we have, once we're at the stage where you're applying for tenure promotion for grants, how do we track all of these wonderful metrics? So one thing, and this kind of bridges the gap between measuring or disseminating your work and tracking your work, is scholarly networks. These are 4 of the main ones that are in use. ResearchGate is a science-heavy network. Academia.edu has pretty broad coverage across the disciplines. But these are all designed for ways for scholars to find research, and they're all quite popular. And I'll show you in a bit my ResearchGate profile, because we can also use it to track our metrics. And I will say I'm not a very prolific publisher. I have 2 articles in a book. So, but my articles are in ResearchGate, and it tells me every time someone views, downloads, and it does track citations a little incompletely. And it also gives you a central ResearchGate score. Mine is very low because I'm not, again, that prolific. But the more people are interacting with your work in this scholarly network, the higher your score will be. And you can see here they give pretty detailed metrics, especially for newer works that haven't had time to be cited. Sometimes this is all you've got to show the potential impact of your work. So which scholarly network of these 4 would be best for you really depends on your discipline and where other people in your area of research are active. But again, it's making that stuff available so you can track it later. Some other things that you can use to track your scholarship. ORCID If you haven't signed up for ORCID, I recommend doing so sooner or later. It's essentially giving you a number that we use to tag all of your research so that you can be followed and tracked, which sounds scary. But it just means if you change your name, if you change institutions, if you have a very common name or a name that often gets different versions, instead of trying to pull all of those different versions of your name together for people to find, they find you by your ORCID ID number instead. This is something you sign up for, takes very little time, and then you add information about yourself and your works onto your ORCID profile. So it keeps it all together. More and more journals, and especially grants, are starting to ask for ORCID, which is the most likely time that you'll come across requests for your ORCID ID number. Impact Story is another altmetrics profile that just brings together all of your publications and tracks some of that engagement surrounding your works. It goes beyond journal publications. So lots of options. So hopefully I'm doing okay on time. But kind of overarching thoughts to think about now is how can I track my impact? So the earlier you start thinking in that mode, the more likely you are to have some great metrics that you can demonstrate down the line. And who is evaluating me and what do they want to see? That's when those guidelines come in handy. But the more that you are aligning what you do with how you will be evaluated, the greater your chances of success. And you aren't scrambling at the last minute to try and demonstrate something. And of course, how does this look for my specific discipline? Because there's a lot of varying factors when it comes to disciplinary impact. The library is here to assist you. This is the research guide that I keep talking about, tiny URL. And you can't really see it, but we've got different types of impact, like article level, journal rankings, acceptance rates, book impact, et cetera, broken down with links to individual resources, step-by-step instructions of how to access these metrics and all of that fun stuff. But I am kind of the unofficial resource on campus for any and all questions that you have relating to measuring research impact. So feel free to email me, and I am happy to help each and every one of you. I meet with quite a few faculty every year to help with this stuff. So don't be overwhelmed. Just give me a call. And hopefully we have a few minutes for questions.
Well, I sometimes wonder if I should mention or not mention those small social things. I mean, I recently got a paper with like 14,000 page views or so. And then I feel maybe my colleagues find it a bit silly. I mean, page views, it doesn't say anything really, except that someone looked. Right? So, and also in the context of grant applications and so on, I mean, maybe NSF would feel that it's too superficial. So sometimes I wonder with those more modern measures, is it in my best interest to keep quiet about it or should I mention it?
So my personal take on including things like page views, citation counts are still the best understood and are kind of the most closely related to impact currently. However, page views does tell you something if that's all you have, right? So it is showing people are interacting in some way. We don't know if they're scholars. We don't know why they might be coming. Those are the questions that kind of hang in the air when you use something like page views. But I will say that funders, I always get NSF and NIH confused, but one of them is starting, and possibly both of them are starting to really highlight non-scholarly impact as well. They want to see how is the public actually interacting with your research, and in that case, if that's what they're asking for, something like page views is a really great way to demonstrate that, because it is one of the ways to get beyond just the citation counts and other scholars applying your work. Time for one more quick question. Go for it.
With regard to network web pages like ResearchGate, Academia, if you create your own web page there, should faculty be cautious about posting papers that have been published there, because the copyright policies of these journals almost always say you cannot post the article on another web page. Do people actually get in trouble for that? It
Yeah, I keep waiting for these places to get sued massively. But they make it very explicit, don't put your works up if you don't have the copyright permissions to do so. One, this is a good time to mention that you can negotiate author copyright depending on essentially the journal and the publisher and how they feel about that. Especially because grants like NSF and NIH are now requiring you to publish open access within 6 months. A lot of agreements increasingly are saying it's okay if you put something in a repository like any of these 6 months after publication date. However, generally what the publishers will do is go through and look for all journals or all articles within their journals and then do cease and desist. Just say, hey, you need to take this down, in which case you just create a link to the paywalled version. So yeah, I do not recommend going against copyright. That, of course, is something we never want to strive for, but there are several ways around it. And even if it is behind a paywall, it's still a place where people might be searching for their research or stumble across it while they're looking at their own profile, and then be interested in going to the full text. Okay, well, thank you very much. Enjoy your lunch.